2 Samuel chapter 7, this is what it says. It says, after the king, and that's talking about David, right? After the king was settled in his palace, and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies around him. Now remember that word rest? This is a theme we've seen back in the Garden of Eden, yeah, when God has rest on the 7th day. And this is a theme that we saw with Noah, because remember, Noah sounds like the Hebrew word for rest. And Noah's dad's like, oh, my boy's going to bring people rest. And now we see finally, with the time of King David, we see that there is rest. Because what David does, David is a great warrior, right? And he manages to defeat the Philistines, and he manages to expand the territory of the Israelites, and the people have rest from their enemies. So this is a foretaste, in a way, of heaven, when there will be ultimate rest. Then it says in verse 9, I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have cut off all your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name great. Now when he says I'll make your name great, remember that was what he said to Abraham when he made a covenant with Abraham. I will make your name great. So now God is repeating the covenant to Abraham. He's repeating it to King David. Then he says, like the names of the greatest men of the earth. Verse 10, and I will provide a place for my people Israel. Well, that's a theme we've been seeing a lot as well, isn't it? God's people under God's rule in God's place. And God's place was the Garden of Eden, and he had God's place in the ark, and God's place in the promised land. But then in the time of the judges, you had the other people still living in the land. And now David's managed to drive out his enemies, and God's saying, I will provide a place for my people Israel, and will plant them so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them any more, as they did at the beginning, and have done ever since the time I appointed leaders over my people Israel. I will also give you rest from all your enemies. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. And the word for house there is the word that means dynasty, or dynasty, however you like to pronounce it. So he's telling David that he is going to establish a dynasty for him. When your days are over and you rest with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you. Now offspring there, the Hebrew word that's translated by the NIV as offspring, is the same Hebrew word that's sometimes translated as seed. And if you remember, back in Genesis 3:15, God promised there was going to be a seed of the woman that was going to crush the devil's head. And this is something we've been following this theme as we've been going through, having a look, seeing that God has a seed that he's promised, and God is preserving this seed. And right here you've got him saying, I will raise up your offspring, your seed, to succeed you. So now we know that this seed is going to come from David. And then it says, who will come from your own body, and I will establish his kingdom. So this is the first time we got something new. Like so far what we've read fits with the Abrahamic covenant. Abrahamic just means the covenant that was given to Abraham. So we already knew that God was going to make Abraham's name a great name. And now we've got that echoed for David. We knew that God was going to provide a place for Abraham's people. We knew that Abraham would have many offspring, many descendants. But now we get something new. It says, I will establish his kingdom. So now God's added to the covenant, where now he's saying there's going to be a kingdom, which implies there's going to be a king as well. So this is something new here. Then he says in verse 13, he is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. And when he talks about building a house for his name, he's talking about a temple. And David actually asks if he can make a temple for God, but God's saying, no, you won't. But he's telling him that David's offspring is going to build a temple for him. And it says there in verse 13, I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. So now you're like, wow, whoever this descendant of David is, his throne is going to last forever. Which means, if you're wondering, this can't just be talking about Solomon. Solomon was David's son, right? And you can see here, this can't just be talking about Solomon, because Solomon's throne didn't last forever. So in a way, he might be talking about Solomon, but he can't just be talking about Solomon. And then in verse 14, he says, I will be his father and he will be my son. Now this father-son language is what was used at a coronation, when the king makes his son king, the next king. You know, like in medieval times, maybe they'd say the king is dead, long live the king, or whenever they said that. I don't really know. If Shane was here, we'd ask him. But, you know, in those times, when the king then makes the next guy king, he would use this language of, today you've become my son, and I am your father. And this is what God's saying here about this offspring of David. He's saying, I will be his father and he will be my son. So he's not necessarily saying this person is going to be my son, but he is definitely saying this person will be my king. But later we find out it was also his son. We'll come on to that. When he does wrong, I will punish him with the rod of men, with floggings inflicted by men. But my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. So he's saying here to David that his offspring, when he does wrong, God's going to discipline him. Okay, now, so that then makes us think of Solomon. But then again he says, your house and your kingdom will endure forever. So then you're like, well, that isn't Solomon. So it seems a bit confusing, but what's going on here is that, and this is quite common to find this in the Bible, that God is talking about David's son in the immediate future. David's offspring in the immediate future, which is Saul. But he's also talking about Solomon, which is Solomon here. But he's also talking about David's offspring in the faraway future. And David's offspring in the faraway future is Jesus. And Jesus is going to be the king whose throne will last forever. And Jesus is the one who's going to build a house for God's name. But we also see that Solomon also builds a house for God's name, the temple. But we look at the temple next week. So the point here is that when we look at King David in the Old Testament, what we see is that God makes a covenant with King David and says, your throne is going to last forever, and it's going to be through your offspring. I'm going to make your offspring king. Which means that when we look at David in the Bible, he ultimately points to Christ. David was God's anointed one, God's Christ or God's Messiah. And David's offspring is also God's anointed one, God's Christ or God's Messiah, who is Jesus Christ. So what we're going to do now, we're going to take a moment for questions about this, and then we're going to discuss this, which is, when we read stories about David destroying the Philistines, like Goliath, how can these point us to Christ? And then look up these references to help you. Romans 16 verse 20 and Colossians 2 14 to 15. And when you look up those two references, ask this question: what two different time periods do these verses refer to? Alright, so let's do that now.